Okay, this is my second shot at this. My name is Andrew. Start with who am I? I'm an exercise physiologist and I'm a graduate student at a university, kind of in the center of the state, a town called Ellensburg. There's only one of those here, really. But hey, we're gonna be a little bit politically incorrect here once in a while, so I'll leave the name of the university out of the equation here. So I'm a Category 2, USA Cycling Category 2 road cyclist. Got 10 years of racing and training experience. And really, let's talk about what this vlog is going to be about. Basically, I'm going to talk about the evolution of my thought process about training as I explore my, or go through my graduate studies. We're going to talk about different ways of viewing the processes involved with our training and different ways to think about how to plan training and along maybe some other things too. So basically, I'm going to share my interpretation of research on maybe possibly some abstract physiological concepts, but hey, I'll make it not so abstract. And basically, I mean, occasionally, now and then, I might take a big steaming shit on somebody's belief system in regards to training. But I mean, I try not to. I mean, it's not the intent really. And I'm not an asshole, I swear. So the purpose of this vlog, I think I might have mentioned that before, but it's basically I really like to be able to influence the way people think about training in the body in a way that's kind of common sense and hopefully very, I don't want to say black and white, because the more that you read, the more research you look at, you realize the world isn't so black and white. What we see in popular literature is just basically takes all the details out of the equation. It's almost too simple. So now let's talk about where I'm heading in this video. I'm heading down Highway 97. It looks like I'm about to stop and take a piss. I mean, I think I'd probably had like 40 ounces of black coffee that morning. But in the meantime, while we're watching this, you're not going to see a urine stream or anything like that. It's pointing at the ground. Let's talk about the training status. My training status at the time of this ride. I'm about 2 weeks into a 7-week training block to raise my training volume, because I just finished a relatively low volume training phase, about 12 weeks long, over the fall quarter. I'm mainly doing it's more of a polarized training scheme, doing mainly high intensity interval training, a little bit of Zwift racing, super low volume. Now higher volume, higher purposes to develop higher cumulative stress at intensities below the lactate threshold, possibly, and even do some work to maintain some of those peripheral or in the muscle aerobic adaptations from doing high intensity interval training. And that's something that I feel like a lot of people may not be thinking about. You should be doing some work over your threshold to maintain, even in your base phase, to maintain some of the adaptations that you make in your build phases or race season phases. I mean, in reference to popular literature about training. But that's super important for as far as your body's ability to extract oxygen from the bloodstream. Not to mention, you don't recruit your fast twitch fibers, right? Or at least maybe not until you're very, very fatigued from doing some maximum work. But I mean, the easiest way to redistribute blood flow to the fast twitch fibers is actually through interval training. In my case today, the intent was to do some relatively low cadence work at a above critical torque, right? Basically the torque in which I wouldn't be able to sustain for a long period of time. It correlates very well to critical power, which is basically the power that you can sustain for a very long time without fatiguing. Andrew, my name is Andrew. Andrew Kogan, who the author of Training and Racing with a Power Meter, mentioned critical power. It's similar to his FTP concept. I like critical power because it could be a little bit more individualized, because you can take into consideration power durations above that 20-minute, and I feel like you can look at that to give you some ideas of what you are as a rider. So in today's case, I did some lower cadence work, again over that critical torque threshold, to get some activation of the fast twitch fibers and create a little bit of hypoxia. And that's key, because that hypoxia is what that's what causes you to grow more capillaries, or signals for the growth of more capillaries when you do high intensity interval training. But the caveat here is I am still trying to give my body a break from that kind of stimulus. So heart rate doesn't go quite as high doing low cadence work, largely due to less adrenergic or fight or flight stimulation of the heart. And that's really what I'm trying to avoid at this time. Give my autonomic nervous system kind of a break from that kind of strain, while maintaining the changes to the muscles, like I mentioned before, the peripheral adaptations. I mean, there could be another approach to this, simply just doing VO2 max work, but just much lower volumes. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Now, talking about the significance of this critical power, right? Critical power, like I said, is an intensity or a power that you can sustain for long periods of time. We also have something called a W prime, which is basically how many kilojoules you can produce on top of the number of kilojoules you're producing from your maximum kilojoules per second from your critical power. How many kilojoules you can produce in an effort that's over your critical power intensity. Sounds confusing. It's been attributed to your anaerobic capacity. I just say it's just your capacity to do work beyond a metabolic steady state. Basically, your ability to do work at a rate that's faster than which you can basically recycle energy. And ideally, when you go over into your W prime, when you start consuming W prime, you're likely using a lot more of your fast twitch muscle fibers. And you can also look at something called an endurance parameter index, right? This endurance parameter index looks at the ratio between your critical power and your W prime, right? So if you look at someone who has a relatively high W prime relative to their critical power, they're not going to be as efficient over longer durations as, say, someone who has a lower W prime to critical power. This has likely has something to do with the fact that your fast twitch fibers, they consume oxygen, or they tend to consume oxygen and energy, or ATP, a relatively fast rate compared to the rate at which it can be actually restored and reconstituted. So that's one of the. So with that in consideration, we got to think about your fast twitch fibers and how they impact your long-term endurance capacity, how they affect your efficiency. So you have something called a delta efficiency, which is basically your number of kilojoules of mechanical energy over the kilojoules of chemical energy, basically how many calories or liters of oxygen you're consuming per second, right? And then over the course of a long endurance event, that ratio starts to change, right? So basically you start having to consume, for example, if your threshold is, say, 300 watts, right? The beginning of your time trial, 40K time trial, by the end of it, to maintain that 300 watts, the oxygen cost to maintain that intensity has actually gone up. And so that puts another question, or another thing to divulge from that is this idea that your critical power or your threshold is some kind of fixed value, kind of tosses it out the window. It's kind of a moving target, really. So now the key is you can look at your endurance parameter index, and you can see like, you can really tell, or you should be able to tell, from shorter duration efforts. You can calculate your W prime from that, how well you'll be able to sustain power over many hours, right? Especially if you're a breakaway rider, you're off the front 2-3 hours. It's super important that you have high efficiency, right? So typically the higher that W prime, the more downsloping that bottom part of your power curve is going to be. If you look at the mean maximal power curve, say for example in Golden Cheetah or any other power analytical software for analyzing power, that's what we're looking at here. There have been, for example, you should be able to look at that and have a clue of what kind of rider you are, what kind of attributes your muscle fibers have. There have been studies, a recent study that looked at critical power and found a really strong correlation. I'm talking about an R value of like 0.9 to muscle capillary contacts. Basically, the more oxygen, so higher critical power was associated with a higher or a better capacity to perfuse oxygen to the muscle fibers, along with a higher proportion of type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers. Not so surprising. Talking about a rider who has a higher critical power, we think about someone who has a strong ability to sustain a lot of power output for long periods of time. Looking at other athletes, say for example like a marathon runner, looking about how long a marathon is, right? Little marathoner, about 2 hours, right? Tend to have, between 60 and 80% type 1 muscle fibers. So that's when it comes to deciding what you need to do in a race, that's something you definitely do need to consider. That's why you should do some testing. So as far as how do we know that when you ride over your critical power, that we recruit our big fast twitch fibers, right? They do study. Studies on rats have been done. I know this is quite humane, I would say. The purpose of think about the purpose of animals on this earth. Well, what they did was they had the rats run multiple trials on this little treadmill thing to determine their critical power curve, their W prime. And then after they completed the trials, right? They made the calculations, and they split the rats into two groups. One group that did trials over that critical power threshold, and one group that did trials below, right? They haven't finished the trials, and maybe not so sad. Like I said, I mean, I wouldn't want this to happen to me as a human being. They put chemicals in the rats to cause the rats to essentially die. And what they did is they chopped the rat's legs off, and then they dissected the muscles out of the legs, and they looked where the blood went, right? Simple as that. They saw that the rats that ran over a threshold distributed their blood towards the fast-twitch fibers, and the rats who ran below their threshold, or their critical power, saw a distribution of blood flow to the slow-twitch fibers. So what does this tell us about the state of research in this world, and utilization, the purpose for animals? I would say animals do have to serve a purpose. They exist to serve human beings and for the betterment of us, right? I mean, it's the way it is. Animals are eating for food. It's just kind of how it is, and we can also use them for experiments. I mean, really, would you want to? I mean, imagine this. It'd be pretty shitty, right? I mean, you couldn't do that to a human being. Who would volunteer for that? I mean, nowhere. I'm thinking nowhere in the Western Hemisphere would any human subject review board approve a study like that on human beings. Maybe we're talking about in like North Korea or old Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, maybe. I mean, theoretically, you could do it to do these things to a death row prisoner. I mean, like, hey, they say, hey, if I were in that shoe, they would say, like, you want to leave your mark on the world? We'll take some good watts, have you go for a Strava segment. How would that work? But hey, say, hey dude, we'll give you a good meal if you participate in the study before we execute you. Still, even then, that'd be kind of hard to pull. Just a thought, right? Anyhow, as this replies to race strategy, I've had this discussion before with other teammates and whatnot. Given that someone who has a higher ratio of W prime, for example, your W prime, a high ratio as in like someone who has more than a 1-to-1, even though W prime is expressed in kilojoules, say like 40 kilojoules, right, and critical power, usually it's in joules per second or watts, right? So give 320 watt critical power and 40 kilojoules is W prime, right? That'd be pretty close to like a 1.2 endurance index or endurance parameter index, right? So that would be, for example, someone who has relatively low endurance capacity, basically doesn't have the best long duration power comparative to the athlete, compared to the athlete himself, right? Maybe not relative to his competitors, right? Versus someone who has a W prime of like 25 and an FT or a critical power of like 350, right? That would be probably on an order of an endurance index of 0.7. Athlete B would have an advantage in that breakaway, or they'd be a great domestique, the guy you want in the front of your pack, reeling the breakaway in, right? If he's not in the breakaway himself. Although there's a possibility to get into the break as a kind of a punchier rider with a higher W prime. There's some considerations there as far as how you're going to go about doing that, right? You might not want to follow all the attacks. You're going to have to learn how to be economical in that break and not expend watts when you need to. So it comes down to like sitting in for the most part. You got to wait as long as you possibly can before you can make the move into that breakaway. You always got to be looking at who's around you, right? You might have 10 different marked riders who are renowned for getting away in breakaways. You should always know what people are capable of doing. And you have resources like Strava where you can look at people's numbers and time trials and training. You should know who's strong and who's not, right? So it behooves you to, if you know you're not the strongest if you know you're not so efficient over longer distances, behoove you to wait for several attacks to go. Typically though, if it's not the right composition, it's going to be pulled back, and that might happen several times. It might be the strongest guy who's throwing multiple attacks. Typically that's the best strategy. If you are a high threshold rider, that means you can typically you recharge your battery might not be as big, but you do recharge your battery at a faster rate with a higher threshold. You can recover at a faster, higher intensity. So in that case, you can handle more attacks. Regardless though, you're going to see degradation in your efficiency over time as you generate fatigue from making attacks. So the good way to think about this is you're allowing for a leveling of the playing field by letting the stronger riders make all the attacks and make all the attempts, allow them to get pulled back. Then you're bringing them closer down to your level if you're allowing them to fatigue themselves. It does take a lot of patience to be able to do this, and when you are in that breakaway, you still got to be super cautious about how you spend your watts. I mean, typically though, a higher W prime manifests itself as a great deal of like punchiness. Someone who's a puncher, right? You're typically good at short climbs. It might be tempting to attack the break. That's actually kind of a fucking stupid idea, really. By nature, if you have a higher W prime to FTP, you're going to have your efficiency is going to degrade at a faster rate over the course of a race as you recruit more and more fast switch fibers and accrue more metabolites. Making attacks is only going to accelerate that. So it might seem counterintuitive, but you want to sit in and don't show your strengths. Try not to pedal whenever you can. Cruise below that threshold. If you can take easy pulls without being caught, do it. Skipping pulls is very obvious, but for as long as you can, conserve your watts, right? If you know someone's stronger than you, the name of the game is making them do more work than you. Otherwise, you have no pizzazz left at the end of the day if you've burnt it all up attacking on every little hill. I know I'm not the best at this. I'm more of a punchy rider myself, but I know that when I've been most successful, I've been patient. When I've been least successful, I've been impatient. That's the name of the game with any kind of racing. Even as a stronger breakaway rider, someone with who doesn't see it as great of a degradation in their efficiency over long efforts near the threshold, they still got to be patient too. So they're also modulating their effort. So it is a battle of wits, but hey, that's the fun of racing. So ultimately, we need to make decisions in our training based on what we know our strengths are. Truth be told, too many people following dogmatic practices about how to break through plateaus in training and break through diminishing returns. There's so much more out there. We might talk about that in the next chapter. But hey, by nature, the body's going to resist you and your ambitions with your training, because basically what it wants to do is maintain a harmonious relationship between all of its internal processes, and it doesn't like change, really. Think about a 2-year-old who won't eat burnt toast or won't eat peas. You just got to be creative there as far as getting the toddler to do what you want it to do. So, I mean, as goes with any other kind of relationship with anybody else, you got to be. You can't, if they're gonna say no. It's not the same. I mean, it's like doing the same thing, trying to do more of the same thing that doesn't work. It's kind of like trying to get what you want by yelling louder. But like I said, we'll go into that later. I'm going to err of not being labeled as a sexist, and leave it on this note. Nothing is as black and white as has been fed to you. All right. See y'all later. Bye-bye.